Hello and welcome to this Unit 6 revision video all about 6.2, the wartime economy, looking at the work of people like Todt and Speer and thinking about the use of labour within Germany and also foreign labour outside of it as well. As always, it's a good idea to start by seeing what you can already remember, what you already know about the topic. So pause the video here if you want to brainstorm everything you know about these 5 different areas. Just a reminder as well that all the key points from this video are summarised on this one-page summary of 6.1 and 6.2. So feel free to go through that if you want to see the key points in chronological order. Another revision material that you should have in your folders is this 6.2 Cornell grid. This also contains all the key information that I'm going to go through in this video, including a great timeline, which we'll go through now. Timeline of the wartime economy that comes from that Cornell grid. Pause the video here if you want to make a timeline. Before we can think about the wartime economy in Unit 6, it's important to have a little bit of a recap from Unit 4. Now, I'm just going to go through this very quickly, so if you want to know more depth about it, you need to go back to the 4.3 video on the economy and workers. Now, when the Nazis first came to power in 1933, their priority in the short term was about solving the unemployment crisis that was around from the Great Depression. Their longer term policy was about the 4-year plan, which they had from 1936 after they supposedly won the battle for work. Now, Hermann Goering, who you can see in the picture there, was put in charge of that 4-year plan from 1936, and the idea was that they would get the German economy ready for war by 1940. Now, they hadn't achieved what they wanted to by the time the war broke out, mainly because the war broke out sooner than expected. The 4-year plan was all about making Germany self-sufficient and trying to avoid the issues that they'd had and the reasons why they'd lost the First World War. So they did things like setting production targets and also trying to increase production of key commodities, as well as reducing their dependence on imports. They wanted to make themselves self-sufficient. So they did this in various ways and also tried to encourage people to buy only German goods. Now, this 4-year plan did have a substantial impact on the German population. Even Goering himself admitted that Germany was going to have to choose between guns or butter. Essentially, it meant that there was reduced consumer goods as they were focusing their economy on the military instead. So there was a problem of things like food shortages, rising prices, and poor living conditions for a lot of ordinary Germans. And this had caused some disillusionment with the regime. Now, in terms of the success of these policies, they'd wanted to make themselves completely self-sufficient by 1940, and they did manage to make some strides when it came to the economy. However, they did not reach their very ambitious production targets, and for instance, Germany was still importing a third of its goods by 1939. So despite the fact that they had tried to improve their economy and certainly had achieved a substantial amount, for instance, they're producing 3 times as much oil in 1942. They still don't manage to achieve what they wanted and making Germany ready for war by 1940. And the economy is certainly not ready for war in 1939 when the war breaks out. We're now going to look at reasons why there were problems with the wartime economy and why they weren't ready in 1939. The first reason being that Hitler had not expected that the war was going to begin in 1939. He wasn't ready in terms of the production of armaments that would be needed for a sustained war. He also was quite arrogant in the sense that he felt that any war that did break out would be over quickly, and therefore he would never need a total war effort. So he was never ready to conscript women into the labour force, and it wasn't really until it was too late that they made any sort of concessions with actually getting women really en masse to be part of the war effort. Furthermore, just like with the rest of the Nazi state, there was a lot of overlapping organisations, and the Nazi regime did not establish a clear, unified direction of the wartime economy. Just like how we've seen before, there was lots of overlap between different terror organisations, for instance. There was also a lot of overlap and competing directions from different offices within Germany, including the Defence, Economy and Armaments Office, the Ministry for Armaments and Munitions, and the Economic Ministry, where they don't all agree on what they're doing, and there isn't that sort of good level of leadership to provide that direction. Furthermore, if we think about Goering and his role as, the economics minister, he basically lacked the technical and economic knowledge to do his job effectively. Even Speer talked about the time where Goering was in charge as the era of incompetence. And basically, he had poor relations with military leaders and with industrialists, and he was just worried about building up his own economic empire rather than meeting the needs of the wartime economy. Linked to that and the fact that he didn't have good relationships with, important people, we can see that here as well, where there were lots of different branches of the armed forces that all demanded highly specialised equipment built to a very high standard that was expensive and inefficient. What they needed to do was streamline the amount of weapons so that they could actually concentrate on mass production of those and make it much more efficient. As you've just seen, there are a lot of issues with the wartime economy. Now, what we're going to think about now is the role of Fritz Todt between 1940 and 1942, because he did try his best to try and make Germany much more efficient in their use of labour. He did want to rationalise their production, and these are all things that Speer was credited for later on, but were actually a lot of Fritz Todt's ideas that he just wasn't able to put in place. Now, Fritz Todt was a really good organiser, and he is somebody that had a key role in the building of the autobahns in the 1930s. Because he was so successful with that, he was then appointed as Minister for Armaments in 1940, and he tried straight away to improve the efficiency of the wartime economy. Now, the issue for Fritz Todt is, despite the fact that he has those good ideas that would have extended the war and would have helped Germany win the war as well, he didn't have a good working relationship with Hitler in the same way that Albert Speer did. So he wasn't very good at kind of playing the political game. For instance, he did things like openly criticising Hitler for the declaration of war on the USA due to their industrial potential. So he was much more thinking about the reality of war rather than thinking about his own personal position and using that to try and get the job done. So he did come up with some good policies that would have helped Germany, but he wasn't able to get those put in place in the same way that Speer was. So it was good for Germany that Fritz Todt then dies in a plane crash in February 1942, because that allowed them to appoint Speer to that position, and obviously Speer then extends the war potentially by up to 2 years because of his strong working relationship with Hitler. We're now going to think about the role of Albert Speer. Now, Albert Speer, remember, had joined the Nazi Party in 1931 when he was a young architect. He had helped design things like settings for Nuremberg rallies and became Hitler's personal architect, building some key Nazi buildings as part of that job. Now, in 1942, he becomes Minister of Armaments after Fritz Todt's death in a plane crash. And in that job, he managed to revolutionise the economic performance of Germany, despite the fact that there were lots of adverse circumstances. It mentions here about the bombings, which hopefully you've seen in Unit 6.1. Remember that they started with bombings in March 1942 with the bombing of the city of Lübeck, and then it grew in greater intensity in 1943. Remember that between March and July 1943, 43 German cities were bombed. Now, Speer is able to make some drastic improvements to the German economy, and that's because of that strong relationship with Hitler. Hitler had previously ignored the economic problems that Fritz Todt had brought to him. Fritz Todt had been arguing about needing more central control and to try and solve those fundamental problems with the economy that we looked at earlier. However, it's only when Speer was brought in that steps were taken to achieve those changes. So the key turning point is the Central Planning Agency from April 1942. So through this, they are able to give Speer overall control of the wartime economy and make it so much more efficient than it had been. Remember, he doesn't just do this, he's also really important for other aspects of wartime policy, including the use of forced foreign labour and also getting more women into factories as well from 1943. So let's now think about one of Speer's key policies of the Central Planning Board. So remember that they had previously had real issues with not having standardised weapons, being incredibly inefficient with creating lots of different types of weapons across lots of different factories, not using things like mass production techniques, not using labour effectively. For instance, they weren't really using women, and there were lots of different issues with the economy that Speer wanted to address. Now, a lot of them could be solved with this central planning board. Now, Speer was a technocrat and he managed to basically rationalise the process of wartime production and make it so much more efficient. In April 1942, this central planning board was introduced, and essentially Speer now had overall control of the wartime economy. He had complete central coordination of all the different aspects of the wartime economy, including the allocation of labour, whether that was men, women, or foreign labour. He was also able to control equipment and materials as well. So essentially, he was now able to override the previously fragmented bureaucracy and align the army's demands with the factory realities. He was therefore able to effectively exploit the potential of Germany's resources and labour force, for instance, by doing things like concentrating production in fewer factories and on a narrow range of standardised products. He also did things like using greater use of mass production techniques and also introduced shift work to try and keep the factories open and producing for 24 hours a day. Essentially, he is trying to kind of remove the bureaucratic chaos that there was before. He is trying to make sure that there isn't that sort of inefficient and wasted manpower. And he basically does this by this policy of centralizing decision making in Nazi Germany. Now, this was desperately needed, as we know previously, they had been incredibly inefficient. Process of rationalization leads to something called the production miracle. And we can see this in some of the statistics here. Remember that you are not expected to remember all these statistics, just pick one from each section that you're going to know. So if we're thinking about this production miracle, well, within 6 months, ammunition production increased by 97%, tank production increased by 25%, and in total, arms production increased by 59% in 6 months. If we think generally between 1941 and 1943, aircraft production increased by 200%, tank production by 250%, and we can also see when it comes to their fighter aircraft, the main one being the Messerschmitt, they now only produce those in 3 factories. The fact that they were reducing the amount of factories and becoming specialists in creating those, as well as using mass production techniques, meant that production of these crucial aircraft increased from 180 a month to 1,000. Now, we can also see here that industrial production generally peaks in the second half of 1944, despite the fact that there's a lot of bombing still going on at that point. And by that point in the second half of 1944, there is more than a 3-fold increase since 1942, since Speer was appointed the Minister for Armaments. Another key point about Speer's policies is that he was able to better mobilise the labour force. Now, Speer is somebody that knew that he needed to make better use of labour. He prioritised military needs over Nazi ideology, when it comes to things like the use of women working. And he also exploited foreign labour much more systematically. It'd been used before he'd been appointed, but now it was much more efficient in the use of it. Now, they still experienced severe labour shortages by 1944 to 1945, but his better mobilisation of labour explains why German war production continued to rise even when the Allies were bombing much more intensively from 1943. So if we think about then the start of the war pre-Speer, what was it like with the labour force? Well, first of all, conscription led to shortages of labour. Obviously, they had wanted to get as many men fighting as possible. And earlier Nazi policy had discouraged female employment. They hadn't wanted women working, they wanted women in the home having children. They also had some foreign labour, but they hadn't really maximised it as much as they could have done. They started off with Polish civilians and prisoners of war, but it wasn't really expanded until 1941, after the Soviet counterattacks in the winter of 1941. That's when Hitler had issued a decree saying that they could use the Soviet prisoners of war. Don't forget, also in June 1941, there is the decree issued by Goering that said that all women workers that were receiving a family allowance and had given up paid employment but not had children had to register for war work or lose their allowance. And remember that was seen as really unfair because it only actually affected working class women that had worked previously, and it only led to another 130,000 women working as well. So it's not until Speer takes over later that they're able to use women much more effectively. Now, Speer was somebody that was obviously very pragmatic. He had become the Minister for Armaments after the death of Fritz Todt in February 1942. And when he first became the Minister for Armaments, he had a man called Sorkel set up the Plenipotentiary General for Labour Allocation. Now, essentially, that was just an organisation to try and make better use of foreign labour. A plenipotentiary just means someone that has full power of independent action on behalf of the government. So basically, somebody that is in charge of making sure that they use a lot of foreign labour. Now, by 1944, as we'll look at in a bit, foreign labour has actually made up a quarter of the German workforce, and they did become essential to the wartime economy. However, the poor conditions did limit their productivity, and actually the recruitment of foreign labour couldn't solve Germany's economic problems. Their poor treatment, their poor diet didn't make them very productive. But we'll go through that in a bit more detail on the next slide. Don't forget, in 1942, that Speer had the idea of rationalisation of labour, or was able to at least put in Fritz Todt's ideas, and was doing things as well, like making sure that factories were open 24 hours a day. Now, there is a change over time. It's important that we remember to flag that up to examiners, that we have a good understanding. And from 1943, after the defeat at Stalingrad, things change a bit for Speer, and he's able to even better mobilise the labour force because now he's allowed to use women as well. So remember that there had been that June 1941 decree from Goering that had said that some women needed to go back to work, but that only led to an extra 130,000 women actually working. Now, Speer is able to use his good relationship with Hitler to suggest that actually they needed to shift their priority from ideology to actually the needs of the war. And he was able to get Hitler to allow them to pass a decree in January 1943 that said that all women between the ages of 17 to 45 had to register for war work unless they were somebody that was exempt. For instance, they were pregnant or they had 2 or more children. Now, this wasn't as far-reaching as Speer wanted, and actually it only led to an extra 500,000 women working by June 1943. It wasn't just women, though, that were now expected to register for war work. It was also now compulsory for men between the ages of 16 and 45 to register for war work too. And as part of these total war measures as well, they did things like closing non-essential businesses as well. Remember that women, the age that they were expected to register for war work does extend in summer 1944 when the military situation gets even more desperate, and it increases to the age of 50. And women working were absolutely crucial. By the end of the war, remember, they make up 60% of the labour force because a lot more men have gone off to fight. Speer also wanted to use those women as well in auxiliary roles in the army. And remember, by the time we get to January 1945, there are 470,000 female auxiliaries. He also does try to make sure that he's making better mobilisation of the labour force with workers generally as well. Remember, later on in the war, when things get more desperate after things like the D-Day landings, there are some changes for the workers as well, where there's the total ban on holidays for workers. The average working week is extended to 60 hours. And remember, they also switched to a piecework system rather than hourly pay as well. We've just mentioned about the use of forced labour very briefly, but we need to go through it in a little bit more detail now because this is a key aspect of Speer's wartime policies and how he makes the German economy more efficient. So they had used some foreign labour before Speer was appointed the armaments minister. In 1939, they had begun initially with Polish civilians and prisoners of war, and this had expanded from 1941 after the Soviet counterattacks in the winter of 1941. As a result of the Soviet counterattacks and the kind of more desperate situation, not having that same initial success of blitzkrieg tactics that they had earlier on, Hitler had agreed that Russian prisoners of war could be used as slave labour. This wasn't just, a small amount of people that were now working for Germany, but within months, it had led to 4 million slave labourers, whether that was civilians or prisoners of war. Now, from March 1942, this is when we get a much greater use of slave labour. Remember, that's when Speer is appointed armaments minister, and he then appoints Fritz Sauckel to run the plenipotentiary general for labour allocation. Now, this is essentially the organisation that is thinking about mass deportation and mass enslavement of people and forcing them to go to work for the German wartime economy. If we think about the role of Fritz Sauckel himself between 1942 and 1945, in his role as leader of this organisation, he was responsible for the rounding up and transportation of 2.8 million workers to Germany, as well as putting through, over 14 million people through these horrendous conditions working for Germany. You can see the statistic here, a really crucial one to know about how by 1944, the use of slave labour is making up 25% of their total workforce. So absolutely crucial for them being able to continue the war effort. Now, the conditions for these foreign labourers were absolutely awful. Conditions were harsh, discipline was severe, and wages were also low. Now, they also had a hierarchy of nationality and race within foreign labourers, with some treated better than others. The so-called volunteer Western guest workers, who obviously were still forced into this, were paid generally almost equal or equal in some cases to German workers. However, people from the East, the forced workers from there, were paid half of this. And anybody that was a prisoner of war or a concentration camp inmate that had essentially been lent out to the factories to work, they weren't paid and they were living on starvation rations. It's not just a small amount of factories or businesses, corporations that were involved in this. All large corporations and most factories during World War II in Germany used foreign or forced labour. And this is something that earned Speer 20 years in prison for his role in the exploitation of slave labour. Now, it's important to note that this is obviously crucial for their wartime economy, making up 25% of their total workforce. But the use of foreign labour did not solve all of Germany's economic problems. Their poor treatment and diet didn't make them very productive and didn't make the most efficient use of labour generally. It's up to you who you would argue was the most responsible for the use of foreign labour. You could think about both the role of Sauckel and Speer within this. Now, if we're thinking about Sauckel's role, obviously he is the man in charge of the plenipotentiary general for labour allocation. He is the person that was responsible for that organisation, that directed the recruitment, the deportation and the allocation of foreign civilian labour as well. He was also somebody that used force as a means of recruitment, and he is responsible for the mistreatment of enslaved millions of people. So we certainly can't reduce his role. He personally was responsible for the transportation of 2.8 million workers from Eastern Europe to Germany. However, we can't say that he is fully responsible for the use of foreign labour. Speer definitely also has played an absolutely crucial role in this. For instance, as his job of being the Minister for Armaments and being in charge of the Central Planning Board. He ultimately is the person that was in charge of Sorkel. He determined the number of foreign slaves that were required by the German war machine. He is also partly responsible for that decision to recruit by force and for the terrible treatment of those prisoners of war and civilians that had to manufacture arms and munitions for the German economy. So it's up to you what you would argue, whether you would see them as having equal responsibility or not. But obviously, Speer does receive a sentence for his exploitation of slave labour during the Nuremberg trials. We've just thought about a lot of the successes for Speer and how he was able to do things like extending the war by up to 2 years. What we're going to do on this slide here is think about what were the limitations to success and how did things like the bombing limit what Germany could have achieved under Speer's measures. So if we first of all think about the economic impact of bombing and how this negatively affected the German wartime economy. Now remember that bombings had begun in March 1942 with the RAF bombing the city of Lübeck, and then that continued in 1943 when it reached a much greater intensity with 43 cities that were bombed between March and July. Now, between 1942 and 1945 then, Allied bombings against Germany were really focused on their industrial capacity. They had wanted to damage their ability to become fully efficient with their economy, but they'd also wanted to damage worker morale and lead to the end of the war that way. However, they didn't achieve what they wanted, and gains were made during these campaigns. If we think about when arms production peaked, it peaks during August 1944, despite the bombing raids. And Speer does this because he's very clever at the way that he disperses factories, not leaving them all in the big cities where they're easy targets. Instead, he dispersed them against rural areas. And he also had a system of repair culture, where essentially they would try and repair factories and get them reopened as quickly as possible. Now, we can't say that bombing didn't have a significant impact on the German wartime economy. Obviously, it did lead to damage of things like supply lines, and it also meant that factories had to be dispersed, which was good in some ways for Germans, but obviously it meant that it was a little bit more inefficient and difficult to get resources to them. And obviously the bombings also affected work morale, especially as they had no rest with things like the Americans and British bombing day and night. It's been calculated that the bombings resulted in 35% fewer tanks and 31% fewer aircraft than they would have done if the bombings hadn't happened. And therefore, Germany had to divert significant available resources towards the construction of defence measures like anti-aircraft guns. And if there weren't these bombing campaigns going on, they could have used that for things like tank production. Ultimately, the bombings did stop them achieving their desired total war economy. And by January to May 1945, for those last months of the war, it did cause an actual reduction in the amount of armaments being produced. There's also some general limitations to success as well. So despite the production miracle, Speer could not fully solve Germany's labour crisis. Obviously, he wanted women to be used earlier and wasn't allowed to use women until 1943. And even then, they didn't exploit women as much as they could have done and as much as other places like Britain had done for the war effort as well. So generally, the German economy had the ability to produce even more than it did. The industrial production peaks in August 1944, but it could have achieved more than it did at that point. Poor working conditions led to low productivity amongst forced labourers. And also some lands were plundered and therefore not exploited with real economic efficiency. For instance, Speer, despite the fact that he had greater control over the economy, couldn't always control the SS and Gauleiters who operated on their own levels and with their own agendas. An overall summary of Speer then. Now, Speer is seen by all historians as having a positive impact on the Germans' ability to fight the war. Obviously, it's claimed that he extended the war by up to 2 years as a result of those policies. Now, to what extent you would give Speer the credit for those policies is up to you. You could emphasise the role in Fritz Todt and the fact that he had a lot of those ideas already, and that Speer was the one that was just able to put them into practice. You could even think about the fact that it is Speer himself that is able to do that because of that strong working relationship with Hitler and the fact that he was somebody that Hitler trusted. He was also a good organiser, and he was somebody that was willing to do what was necessary, whether it was using women and putting Nazi ideology on the back foot, or whether it is about the use of forced and slave labour. He certainly did make the German wartime economy much more efficient. Don't forget all of his measures as well were doing things like having factories open 24 hours a day and also making sure that factories were more dispersed as well. He also made sure that he allocated resources and tried to have a greater control of the economy through the Central Planning Agency. Albert Speer certainly did manage to improve Germany's mobilisation of labour by centralising control over it and also rationalise production, so much so that he was able to achieve the production miracle. His reforms explain why the German war production managed to increase in the years of intense Allied bombing, despite those worsening military conditions. However, we don't want to be too positive about his impact on the German wartime economy. It was temporary. It was dependent on the exploitation of all of those people that were forced to work in horrendous conditions. And ultimately, his efforts were insufficient to overcome Germany's strategic defeat. He was punished at the Nuremberg trials and did receive a 20-year sentence, mainly for his role in the use of slave labour. But he was able to have quite a light sentence considering that he was a top Nazi by that point, and that is based on the fact that he refused to listen to Hitler in the last couple of months of war. When there were advancing Soviet troops, he refused to destroy German industry, talking about the importance of post-war recovery within Germany. So therefore, he wasn't given the death sentence, despite the fact that some people had expected that he would have done, based on the fact that he'd managed to extend the war. I'm not going to go through this, but this is a summary of this unit in just one slide of all those key points that we've talked about. Please try and use the 6.2 short answer test to help you learn those key facts for this unit. And if you're looking to consolidate your knowledge, as always, it's a good idea to plan out the answer to an exam question. There are lots in your black folders, but this one would be a particularly good one. So this one, the handling of the economy was poorly coordinated, and this accounts for the weaknesses in the German wartime production between 1939 and 1945. Remember to show a knowledge of change over time, because we don't want to make those judgments that are too absolute. We want to show a knowledge of the role of different people, different factors, and that change over the different phases of the war, if possible. Okay, thank you so much for watching the video. Hopefully you feel a bit more confident on 6.2. If you're still not feeling quite sure, make sure that you're having a go at some consolidation activities, whether it is exam plans or maybe doing something like some red pen, black pen.